For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Murli. Author Julian Brown joins me to discuss his book, The Road to Soweto. Your book was out in time for the 40th anniversary of the 1976 Soweto Uprising. Was this what prompted you to research and write about the uprising?
Strangely, no. I mean, it's a wonderful coincidence and I'm very happy about the timing. But this book started a long time before. The book draws from my PhD thesis, which I worked on between 2004 and 2009, so quite a long time before it's actually published. The work is very much a reflection of my understanding of what was important at that time in the mid to late 2000s. What I wanted to do was to try to understand how the politics of that present moment, it was a moment of new social movements emerging after a series of protests, the birth of Abashlali Basiam Jondolo in Durban, the height of the TAC as an activist force in the public sphere, and other such movements. How it was that the politics of the 2000s could be understood. Did they come out of nowhere? Did they come out of the past? And if they did come out of the past, where did they come from? And in my PhD thesis, and in The Road to Soweto, what I suggest is that if we look back over the past 40, 50 years of South African politics, we see moment after moment in which new movements, new politics, new forms of activism emerge from the ground up. And the kind of protests we were seeing in the mid-2000s, and that I think we're still seeing 10 years later here in South Africa today, are in many ways similar to the kind of politics and the kind of protests that developed in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the decade before Soweto. And what I try to do in this book is tell the story of that decade, the road to Soweto, and the ways in which new forms of politics, new forms of protest, new forms of ideas, new forms of solidarity, all came together in that decade to create the uprising, to create that major political catalyst that changed South Africa. And I suppose at the moment of the 40th anniversary of the uprising, in a moment in which we're looking at a resurgent politics from the ground up, the politics of protest, politics of dissent. To look at that moment today through the lens of the past makes us ask different questions about both the 1960s and the 70s on the one hand, and the 2000s and the 2010s on the other. Are we looking at another revolutionary moment in South Africa? Will there be another catalyst? Questions that are not possible to answer in advance, but the past and the studies of history help us understand as they develop in the present moment.
You write about the formation of the South African Students' Organization and state that it was not intended simply to be a student organization designed to articulate the academic concerns of black students. Can you expand on this?
One of the slogans of a liberal student politics in the 1960s, a particular branch of student politics that sought to evade dealing directly with apartheid, was the idea that student politics should be students for students, and that student politics should only deal with on-campus activities. So things like lecture timetabling, the kind of food served in cafeterias, residential accommodation standards, and so on and so forth. What SASO, the South African Students' Organization, did, and to be fair, not only SASO, was to say that no, student politics are not simply about students' working and living conditions, because students are not only students. Students are also people. Students are also citizens. Students are political agents. And the world that students live in, the world of the university, is not cut off from the rest of society. It is part of society. And that student issues are thus societal issues. SASO was a movement formed directly to address the needs and the concerns of black students. And in apartheid South Africa, the needs and concerns of black students were not lecture timetabling, residential accommodation standards, or even food quality at the university cafeteria, although all of those things were the subjects of protests and strikes at the time. Rather, what drove black students were black lives. And black lives were defined by exclusion, by poverty, by the arrogance of the white state, and sometimes even the arrogance of liberal white students and others who supported, in principle, the equality of black students, but did not live up to it in their real life engagements with them. So for SASO, to be a political movement for students was to be a political movement first and foremost. It was to claim that black students and to assert that black students were equal. They could act. They had understandings of their own lives and interpretations of their own social experiences that mattered. Their lives mattered, their politics mattered, their experiences mattered. And those lives and those politics and those experiences exceeded the boundaries of the university. And so any movement that sought to speak to any part of the black experience, whether that was a student-focused movement or not, had to speak to every part. Nothing was separable.
You state in your book that the Durban Strikes during the 1970s were consistently interpreted at the time through the lens of student protest. Briefly tell us about the Durban Strikes and what you mean by that statement.
Okay. So first, let me just introduce the Durban Strikes. In January to March of 1973, more than 60,000 African men and women went on strike in Durban. From a small beginnings, about the 9th of January, through to its height in mid-February, when the Durban municipality workers went on strike and tens of thousands of people took to Durban's city streets. The city's industries were gripped by the longest and most intense and largest wave of strike action that South Africa had seen since the 1950s. This moment, 3-month-long moment, signaled the resurrection of labour politics, and particularly African labour politics in South Africa. As such, it's an incredibly significant moment in our history that probably doesn't get the attention it deserves. It is the Durban Strikes that created the context within which later commissions of inquiry liberalised the laws around trade unionisation and allowed for legal African trade unions. It changed how South Africa worked. It's also notable because these were strikes that were successful. Over the course of the 3 months of the strikes, the majority of striking workers were able to earn some form of wage increase. Only a tiny minority were fired, which was perfectly legal within the system at the time. And so not only was the Durban Strikes a sign of the potential power of African labour, but it was also a sign for black politics that things could work, that you could get immediate victories as well as continue a long-term struggle. That said, one of the reasons, as I argue in the Road to Soweto, that these strikes were so successful was that they were not understood by the state and by businesses at the time to be this resurgent African trade unionization. They weren't understood as the first wave of what would become in the later 70s and 1980s a major reconfiguration of South African politics. Instead, they were understood, and I suggest this in the book, through the lens of the previous decade of student protest. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that for half a dozen to 10 years before 1973, white students and then black students had taken to the streets and had marched and had made political demands. The police had figured out a way of containing the individual protests and ensuring that although some forms of political dissent were permitted, they didn't get out of hand, at least out of hand in the eyes of the apartheid state. This meant that when the initial strikes began in Durban, the police applied a method of policing that had worked for student protests. They allowed the protests to continue within limits. Protests often took place within the workplace and didn't spill out onto the street, not at first. Politics continued to develop, and the protests continued to develop on a pattern that assumed that they were isolated, that they were small scale, and that they wouldn't develop. By the time that it became clear that these protests were not isolated, small scale, and short-lived, they developed such a presence that policing had to take place differently. So the initial response to the Durban strikes took place through the lens of student protests, through the expectations set up by student protests, and that shaped the state response. There is another level, though. For the apartheid government and for several ministers within it, it was unimaginable that black workers could come up with a political strategy on their own. The most obvious explanation in the eyes of the apartheid state for black worker activism was that somebody else was manipulating them, and the most obvious candidates were students. Some imagined black students at Soweto could be playing a role, but most imagined it was white students at the National Union of South African Students, NUSAS, who had to be the brains behind black labour. Now, there is no evidence that they were. There was no evidence at the time. Nothing was ever possibly proven. Workers went on strike because workers could see that their own lives were difficult and that they were being paid an unfair wage. We do not need students to explain the strikes. But the state did use students as an explanation. And the initial responses, the initial political responses, were to crack down on student activists rather than on workers. 8 activists associated with NUSAS were banned in February. A further 8 student activists associated with black consciousness were banned later that month. This was the first wave of an assault against student political activists, and it was motivated by the Durban strikes, which had nothing to do with student activists. In essence, what I suggest in looking at this moment is that the apartheid state missed the significance of the Durban strikes by focusing on what it already knew about student politics, but at the same time used the Durban strikes as a moment and as an excuse to crack down on student protests. And so this period in 1973 becomes a linchpin for a shift in black politics, away from universities and towards the workplaces. And that shift, which has its resonance in the Soweto Uprising, will reach its height in the 1980s.
There have been many books written about the 1976 Soweto student uprising. What makes this book different?
I think what this book does differently is it puts the 1976 uprising in a new context. Many of the previous books in 76 have focused on one or another trajectory of protest. There are books that focus on the role of trade unions in 76. There are books that focus exclusively on the role of black consciousness in 76. And there are many other books, many excellent books, that focus simply on June itself, that look at the story of what happened on the 16th, 17th, 18th, and so on and so forth. And the context that they put the Soweto Uprising in is a context of Soweto itself. Now, all of these are valuable. All of these are important. All of these tell part of the story. But none of them can tell every part of the story. And while I wouldn't claim that my book tells the whole story, no book can, what it does is it tells a different story. It tells a longer story. The book starts in the early 1960s, after the banning of the ANC and the PAC, after the failed armed struggle within the country, and after the Rivonia trial and the imprisonment of most of the leaders who had led the 1950s led activism in the 1950s. The book tells the story of how students and workers and ordinary men and women reimagined the possibility of politics at the height of the apartheid state's success. It shows how small protests on university campuses grew into large protests that went out into the cities. It shows how small strikes on individual workplaces grew into massive strike waves. It shows how new forms of political struggle and old forms of protest, of mass rallies, of mass marches, came together with new participants, with people who had not participated in the 1950s activism, who had been too young to be members of the ANC and the PAC in the legal period, and how in a mix of memories and of misinformation and of reinvention, these young men and women experimented with new forms of politics, new forms of ideas, and new forms of protest. And in doing so, they broke open new ground. They made the Soweto Uprising possible. Because what this meant is that 10, 12, 14-year-old school children in Soweto did not have to completely reinvent a repertoire of protest, did not have to act without precedent. Rather, they could draw upon the actions that their teachers had done when their teachers were university students. They could see the kinds of worker protests that were continuing after 1973. And they could find multiple forms, multiple models of protest to draw upon. And in doing that, and in capturing the attention of the world, and yes, in the brutal, vicious response of the state to the school children's uprising of '76, in all of that, we can see the decade of dissent, the decade of protest, the decade of experiment that preceded Soweto coming to fruition.
Did you learn anything from writing this book, and if so, what was it?
Oh, an enormous amount. When I was younger and starting this project, and we are talking a dozen years ago now, I thought I knew what the anti-apartheid struggle looked like. I thought it was a struggle of movements. I thought it was a struggle of mass politics against an oppressive force. I was naive. The more I looked into the past, the more I learned about men and women acting individually, acting in small groups, acting in contexts of great danger to themselves. And the more I've looked at the past, the more I've looked at the present through those lenses. To me, it seems that it's vital that we understand the world as a world of people. It's a world of people acting individually, acting dangerously, acting under conditions that continually need to be redefined and redescribed. And in looking at the past and looking at the present through the lens of the past, I am consistently amazed by the wealth, the richness, the beauty of people's lives. They take place under horrible circumstances sometimes, and sometimes not. But people are consistently fighting for a better world. And each time that I find another example, whether it's in the past or the present, of someone choosing to put their lives, their comfort, on the line for a better world, I am amazed once again, and encouraged, and made hopeful.
What do you hope people will take away after reading this book?
What I hope that people will take away from this book is first, that our history is a history of people, that there are many different ways of telling South Africa's history, but at the core of all of those are the choices of men and women putting their lives on the line. But I also hope that people will look at the present moment differently. The past is not a foreign country. The past is not alien to us. Certainly the past, a mere 40 years ago, is still very much a part of our present. And if we look at our present moment with a better understanding of how we came here, we can, I hope, develop a richer, more emancipatory politics that acknowledges the difficulties of democracy, but that does not shy away from them.
That was author Julian Brown discussing his book, The Road to Soweto.